You're listening to Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan.
Welcome to Women's Media Center Live. I'm Robin Morgan. I need to begin with a few words about the loss of Gwen Ifill this past week at age 61 to uterine cancer. Gwen was a groundbreaking journalist who had covered the White House, Congress, and many national campaigns over 3 decades for the Washington Post and the New York Times and NBC and, of course, PBS. She was an African-American woman breaking barriers in a field dominated by pale males. And, of course, she most recently was the moderator and managing editor of the public affairs program Washington Week on PBS, and together with her co-anchor and co-managing editor of NewsHour, Judy Woodruff, they comprised the first all-female anchor team on network nightly news. I'm particularly proud that last year, 2015, she and Judy were awarded the Women's Media Center Pat Mitchell Lifetime Achievement Awards, and in fact, they were guests on this program. If you go to iTunes or WMC.com and check out episode 145, you'll hear that in-depth interview. There was something so dignified about Gwen on camera, and she was funny and bawdy and terrific off camera, and I can somehow just imagine her looking around at the state of things post-election and saying, "Good luck with that, my friends. I'm out of here." She will be much missed. We also have 2 remarkable guests in today's program, one to investigate what really happened with the polls, and one to investigate what's happening in the evangelical Christian community with a Christian Evangelical Conservative woman who's a pal. But first we need to go inside the headlines. Someday, historians, if they still exist, will have to cope with intelligent, baffled students studying this period, asking, but how could, but why didn't? So here are some facts to help us try to see a bit more clearly, because there's a lot of misinformation out there. A number of important facts get lost in over-attention to and sentimentalizing about the white working-class voter in great economic pain. We hear this from pundits and, of course, from the left, reverting to a 19th century class analysis. First, that analysis ignores black working-class voters, who went clearly for Hillary Rodham. Second, it ignores findings by numerous sociologists and polls that white blue-collar voters were actually motivated less by economic factors than by fear of being replaced by and losing power to men of color, whether citizens or new immigrants, and all women. It also ignores what lies beneath the rural vote, and rural is where most of Trump's voters reside. A census report last year noted that U.S. cities are home to 62.7% of the U.S. population and comprise only 3.5% of land area. Half the United States population is clustered in just the 146 biggest counties out of over 3,000 counties. 14 states, a few in the Deep South, a few in New England, and a few in the Great Plains, contained none of those biggest counties, and another 19 only contained 1 or 2. The global trend is toward cities. American youth also is moving out of rural and into urban areas, while folks in their 50s and 60s are moving to rural and small-town destinations, and older generations have twice as many conservatives as liberals. Add to this mix that diverse populations are attracted to urban areas, as are new immigrants, and couple this with a decline in faith in our institutions. That's not news, but as columnist Charles Blow noted in the New York Times, institutions are largely urban. The financial center is in New York, as are the centers of publishing, including the most influential newspapers, and media, plus the most influential cultural institutions, the performing arts, museums, music studios, all also urban-based. Gallup senior economist Jonathan Rothwell found that those who view Trump favorably are disproportionately living in racially and culturally isolated zip codes and commuting zones, areas with few college graduates, far from the Mexican border, and from exposure to blacks, Asians, and Hispanics. But hey, they're not unexposed to women, so what about that? Here are some eye-opening statistics from Presidential Gender Watch at the Center for American Women in Politics at Rutgers. The idea that white women abandoned Hillary Rodham is erroneous and misleading. Democrats usually lose with white women. 56% of white women voted for Romney in 2012, 55% for McCain in 2008, and so forth. Actually, HRC outperformed Obama among college-educated white women with 51%, beating Trump by 6 points. She also won married women by 2 points, the first Democratic candidate to do so in 20 years. But what explains the rest of the white women's vote? Party identification. The Pew Research Center has found that the plurality of white women identified as Republicans in 2016, and among those lacking a college degree, that identification has grown over the past 24 years. So far, party outweighs gender in voter decision-making. There is, however, evidence that these very women moved to the undecided or Democratic columns after the Access Hollywood tapes broke, but FBI Director Comey's announcing an investigation that proved baseless sent them scurrying home to their party. Furthermore, claiming women abandoned Hillary not only misrepresents historical facts, but excludes the majority of women who did vote for her. She got 54% of women's votes, with a 13-point gender gap. That includes 94% of African American women's votes, on a par with the number who voted for Obama. She won 86% of Latinas, higher than that support for Obama in 2012. The heart of the modern gender gap is the growing role of women of color. In fact, this election marked the most diverse electorate in U.S. history, with 31% of eligible voters from racial and ethnic minorities, for a net increase of 7.5 million eligible voters. And do not forget that many of these first-time voters faced voter intimidation and voter suppression efforts, since this was the first presidential election in 50 years without the full protection of the Voting Rights Act. 14 states implemented new voting restrictions, including cuts in polling hours and polling places. This must be investigated. But yes, there is some good news. Congress will now have the highest ever level of Latino elected officials, with a record of 38, including 10 total Latinas. The Senate will include a record number of women of color. 3 women join Asian American Senator Mazie Hirono, Democrat of Hawaii, and previously a guest on this program. They are Asian American Tammy Duckworth, Democrat from Illinois, African American and South Asian American Kamala Harris, Democrat from California, and Catherine Cortez Musto, the first Latina ever elected to the Senate. Meanwhile, in the House, Pramila Jayapal, Democrat of Washington State, who has also been a guest on this program, becomes the first South Asian woman to serve in the House of Representatives, and Lisa Blunt Rochester, Democrat of Delaware, the first woman and the first African American woman to represent Delaware in Congress. These are triumphs, especially when you remember that most women come in colors other than white. It's time for a short break here at Women's Media Center Live, but as you know, I'll be back in just a moment, this time with my first guest, Clare Malone from 538, so we can learn just what in hell happened with the polling.
You're listening to Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan.
Welcome back. And now for my first guest. Clare Malone returns to the program. She is a freelance writer and a member of the editorial staff of The New Yorker. And she's also a senior political writer for 538, the website and group that aggregates all the polls and has been the most reliable source. Her work has also appeared in the American Prospect, the Daily Beast, Bloomberg View, and other places. And she is with us today to talk about what happened with polling. Clare Malone. Clare, welcome back to the program.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Well, I've been working hard to understand the concept of probability in polling, and I think I've got it, but I'm not sure. I get it and lose it, and I'm sure you know at 538, because we all rely on you hugely, that there's a stunned outrage out in the world as how could 538 have let us down, even though toward the end I think you were saying that Trump had a 29% chance of winning the Electoral College because of probabilities, right. So explain probabilities again to me and to our listeners. How the hell did this happen?
Sure.
What just hit us? Okay.
Well, yeah. Well, I'll say that we gave Trump the 29% chance of winning, and that was the same that the Trump. Those are the same numbers that the Republicans in the Trump campaign basically had. And I think it'll help your listeners to know what exactly 538 does. So what we do is aggregate public polls. And that means that we don't just put them all into, the poll machine and say, whatever number spits out, that's what happens.
Mm-hmm.
We rate pollsters. And if we have a good pollster who does a poll, we take that more seriously and we weight it differently.
Right.
So what we were doing was, our model was basically spitting out what the public polls were telling us with, some of our smarts mixed in. And they were basically saying, it's not a 0% chance of winning. As there were a couple models that gave Clinton a 98% chance of winning. Right. And that was never something that we said. He always had a shot at winning.
Hang on a second. But you did say
Sure.
At one point, because I remember my mind clung to this, you at different times had Clinton at between a 67% chance of winning and as high as an 80% chance of winning.
Correct.
So that's of course what people remember, and then they say, "What? Go on."
Well, because polling changes, so at different points during the race,
right.
People felt more favorably towards Clinton, and I think there are many factors that I think went into Clinton's loss. I will say that we are probably going to see that the Comey letter had a bit of an impact with certain demographic groups in certain states.
Yes.
But what happened this election was, and I think this is something that pollsters will be really taking a look at, is there were people who Trump outperformed his polls, Republicans outperformed their polls, which means that more people came out to vote in certain places than pollsters expected. And, in my reporting in Ohio, I went to Ashtabula County and I sat down with the Board of Elections woman a week before the election.
Mm-hmm.
And she said, I can't tell you, we've had a huge uptick in voters who were deleted off the rolls, meaning people who haven't voted for cycles and cycles and cycles. And she said, I can't tell you what candidate it's for. That's not something we have on the rolls.
Right.
But based on my reporting in the county, and it did go for Trump heavily, mm-hmm. Those were Trump voters coming out. And we saw them come out in the panhandle of Florida. Mm-hmm. We saw a huge rise in rural votes. And so basically those people weren't part of pollsters' likely universe of voters, which means that they were missed in a lot of places.
Because they dropped out of voting.
They dropped out of voting. So yeah, because public pollsters are using these Secretary of State's lists that say, these are the people that are likely going to be Democratic voters or Republican voters, or just likely voters in general. Right. And so if you're not on those lists because you've been an active voter, mm-hmm. You're probably going to fall out of view of pollsters.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Interesting.
So it's a complicated systemic problem, but I also think Trump was a unique candidate who turned a lot of these people out and got them excited.
Right.
Well,
also your job is not just to predict a winner and a loser, but to measure uncertainty, and you're supposed to account for risk. So,
right.
I understand that, but do we have any take on the undecideds, because I'm one of the people who continually, my eyes roll ceilingward automatically, like in the very last week of a campaign with two such markedly different candidates, with some voters who even voted for Obama twice and then turned around and voted for Trump. Who are these people? What planet are they from that they are undecided at that stage?
Well, I think that people have to remember that Clinton and Trump were both historically disliked candidates. Their unfavorable ratings were both incredibly high.
Yeah.
And based on your political views, you might imbue a lot of meaning into why people are disliked. But that was a fundamental thing. And we thought, I did talk to a lot of people who were Obama voters who were very inspired by him, voted from both times, and were inspired by Trump this time. And a lot of those people were in the industrial Midwest. And perhaps Obama was sort of a candidate who maybe kept certain voters with voting Democratic, 8 years after they maybe would have naturally drifted with another candidate. But I think we saw in the last week, I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but the people who were making up their minds in the last week of the election broke for Trump.
Yes.
And again, I think that could have, if we go back and parse things out, what was the big event that happened? There was a Comey letter.
Yeah.
So we were seeing that people were breaking more towards him in the last part of the election. And I think hindsight is 20/20 always, but I think people might say, she should have focused more on messaging to people in, Michigan. Rather than perhaps going to Arizona, and again, people will always parse these things out. But I think it's also important to remember that we're in such a highly partisan environment that, I do think that people, just even if they found Trump offensive as a person, he was for their team,
Yeah.
And I think Democrats thought, I definitely talked to Democrats who thought, whether they be Bernie people or just people who had sort of a historic dislike of Clinton from the 90s, from her many decades in service, public service. I think it's a fascinating election partially because both candidates had such high name recognition going in, and people have such strong feelings about them.
Yes. Okay, there was a gender gap. I mean, if you leave white working class women and some, depending on the geographical area, some white suburban women out of it, there still was a huge gender gap. So I'm clinging to that with all my might. Afloat in the big sea, I'm holding on to that raft. Most women of all ethnicities and all ages and single and married, most women in fact broke for her. But what do we know about the women who didn't, the white working class women? What do we know about them? And interestingly, there was a New York Times poll some weeks beforehand. I can't remember. I'm looking to see the date, but I don't see it on it right now. But in any event, it was that they had expected to see gaps between older and younger women because the Bernie movement suggested that younger women would be more critical of Hillary Clinton. But that was not the case, they found. They found millennials were more likely than baby boomers So this is fascinating because there were a lot of feminists who were sort of trashing millennials, we now know really, really, really unfairly. But apparently women ages 18 to 29 were, at least at the times of this New York Times poll, much more likely than women over 64 to say that men in general have advantages over women. So talk a little bit about that.
About white working class women or the ones who didn't vote for?
I just asked you 16 questions under the guise of one. Start with the white working class women. Yes.
Sure. Yeah, I think that Clinton, she's perhaps because she is the first woman candidate, there's so much meaning freighted within the women's vote.
Yeah.
I think what we're seeing across gender, but including gender, that whether or not you have a college education really affects the way your world is, your experience of America. And I think that that's something that should stop people in their tracks.
Yeah.
So non-college educated white women voted for Trump. And they voted for Trump in part, I would say, because the worldview that he was communicating tracked with a lot of what they're experiencing. So if you are in places in the industrial Midwest where you're seeing factory jobs go away, I think it's really difficult to imagine a future without the jobs, the life that you know. And I think that's something that we discount. There's also, there's a sort of bleakness in a lot of parts of America, and this is, the opioid crisis is something that is familiar to us. It's been covered quite a bit. So I do think that there is a real difference between people's experience of America, whether or not you have a college education. Of course, I will say that the working class includes people of color, and people of color tended to vote for Clinton. So, but I will say that there's certainly, I think Trump sort of gave people this reconstituted sense of white identity. The idea that, when we talked about issues of culture, it was always Second Amendment rights, respect for the police, sort of, so things like that. I think.
It was an idea of order, and with very, to me anyway, thinly veiled authoritarianism. But it sounded safe, perhaps. And younger women. Why these were not necessarily college-educated younger women. These were younger women in general, and geographically across the country. So, do we know why they broke more? Were they Bernie people who came over, or had they been more, so in quotes, feminist from the beginning, wanting a woman president, wanting her in particular?
I think across the board, younger people are, conservative, liberal, are more, I guess we'll say, left-leaning on social issues. And I think if you were faced with Clinton, not just her being the first woman president, but the real specter of Trump as someone who is accused of sexual predatory behavior, I think for a lot of younger voters, for a lot of younger women, I think it was a view of the world that they were shocked to see sort of come back. It felt like the sort of the blunt force Mad Men, things that I'm under 30. The things that we see on Mad Men or something. I think that's probably it was a shock for a lot of younger women, and I would say this is my guess, going along with just the idea that younger people are more demographically, socially liberal. That was a sort of shocking difference. There was
such a worry at a certain point that many of the Bernie people were so hurt and shocked that he didn't win, and so enthusiastic over him that they would not move to Hillary, but apparently they did, didn't they? It looks that way.
Well, she faced problems with Democratic turnout sort of across the board, or people that she was sort of counting on. Now, the Clinton sort of post-mortem call with her donors basically blamed the Comey letter for depressing the vote of college-educated white women, a group that tended in the past to go Republican, but they were sort of counting on swinging towards Clinton. So a lot of those women
these are the quote suburban women.
Yeah, suburban women, well-educated white suburban women, and they either went back home to the Republican Party, or perhaps they decided not to vote for president. But she also faced major problems in the Black community. Young and old, and that's a huge problem. She lost Michigan by 11,000 votes and underperformed Obama in Wayne County, which is home to Detroit, a heavily Black county. She underperformed Obama by like 60,000 votes.
Right, I've read that. And do we know what happened? Because certainly Obama himself just broke his ass out there working really hard. If I'm a Black voter, male or female, who loves Obama and loved what he did, and he comes to my area and he says, if you don't vote for this candidate to continue my legacy, it's a personal affront to me and everything we've done. What does that voter do with that?
Yeah, I mean, it's I guess it's the great mystery of voting in some ways. We can only put numbers to so many things. Yeah. But I will say that I think it is just a lack of enthusiasm for, frankly, an older white woman on the heels of a younger first Black president. And I think that there is just something within that realm that she didn't make people feel like they were. Maybe it was she didn't make people feel like they were voting for something. It was sort of against something. It is an interesting problem, and I think they were counting on sort of having an increased Latino turnout that would perhaps propel them in certain states.
Yes.
And that didn't end up coming to fruition as they wanted.
Right. Have we asked, or are we asking in the wake of this, analytical questions about, I don't even know if this is measurable because I'm not sure people would tell the truth in their answers, but the degree to which plain flat out sexism 101 played a role, because I know it did. I would stake my life on it. Sometimes people honestly said so flat out, but is there a way to ask and try to measure that? Are we doing that in follow-up analyses?
I'm not quite sure. They do. There is a question that Gallup has been asking since 1937 about, would you be okay with a woman as president? And the majority of Americans say yes. So there are certainly people who are, I would say, flat out sexist and wouldn't vote for Clinton because she was a woman. I would say that number is small. I will say that, sexism, I think, certainly factored into this election, probably a lot in the way she's covered and has been covered for years and years and years. The complicated feelings that people have about the way she sort of came into public life through her husband. That was sort of a thing that was talked a lot about during the 2008 primary that has sort of fallen by the wayside. So it's a hard thing to figure out. I think, like many, the analogy we've been using about Trump's sort of unlikely election is when a plane crashes, many things go wrong. Right. And I think Trump's win is attributable to lots and lots of different things. Yes. Sexism for Clinton certainly played against her. But I think I've sort of been tussling back and forth with this one of, does a woman candidate have to be the best, the most qualified, all these things? Certainly it's true in other areas, Well, yeah, it's certainly true. I wonder, though, if we wouldn't have given a woman candidate with her own problems, who hadn't been in the public life as much, who people didn't have as strong feelings about, who was perhaps more charming, to use the sort of, to reduce it down a bit. Yeah. I wonder if we wouldn't give her a little more slack if Clinton and Trump aren't just particularly divisive. Yeah. Well, people, we might give someone like that more slack. On the other hand, we also might say, well, she lacks the experience. In this case, everybody had to acknowledge, well, she doesn't lack the experience, so there had to be, some other reasons. It's so confounding. One last quick question: the people who lied to the pollsters. One hears a lot about this. What is that? I mean, why did they do so? What does that tell us about people who are ashamed to admit they're for the candidate they're for? And what does this do to polling in the future? Well, we're not necessarily sure that we were seeing what we call shy Trump voters. He did outperform his polls, but that could be, going back to what I was talking about earlier, that could be because the pollsters were just missing these voters, because they were voters who were off the rolls or off the likely list of calls. So we're not quite sure if that is a thing. And I would sort of tend to say Trump people were willing to say they were Trump people. And especially because I think a lot of his support was clustered in areas where, the whole area was for him. Being for Trump was a great the area voted. And right. Yeah. Right. So they had signs on their lawns and they weren't shy about it at all. Interesting. Yeah. Well, if I may, as they say, unpack this more in time to come, if I may, I'm going to return to you because this is very helpful as we're all trying to figure out, what the blank happened. And it may not be as much of a mystery to you, but that it helps very much. I think that to impart that knowledge to us, I think that the educated versus non-educated gap is apparently is a central one and very interesting because it seems to me that a society could address that. And the fact that the young broke so strongly for her is deeply encouraging because if for no other reason that they will, unless the world gets destroyed in the meanwhile, they will outlive whatever harm can be done. You will, and that means that's their sign for hope. Thank you, Clare, and thank everybody at 538 for the work that they've done. Thank you. Thank you so much.
And now it's time for the Surrealism Corner. I acknowledge the temptation of wanting to put the election results in their entirety into the Surrealism Corner, but it's no good getting on the wagon against truth. The other side's doing that very well. So here we're going to try to cling to truth and facts, and the election results were real. Denial doesn't help, and not my president doesn't help. So this is a piece of truth and surrealism that is an unintended consequence of those elections and is truly surreal. Smith & Wesson, the gun manufacturers, announced that they're going to change their name to the highly generic American Outdoor Brands, but they've seen their stock plummet on the news of Trump's ascendancy. A Donald Trump presidency means to them that gun owners don't perceive any more an immediate threat to gun availability, and that in turn means no fear-promulgated impulse purchases from American Outdoor Brands firearms, which in turn means a 20% crash in the value of the company. That's from Bloomberg News, and it is decidedly surreal. Time for another quick pause here at Women's Media Center Live. I'm Robin Morgan, and I will return shortly with my next guest, who will help us understand what happened in the evangelical and conservative community. She herself is an evangelical Christian conservative and a feminist. Stay tuned.
You're listening to Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan.
And we're back again. This time to talk with Marybeth Glenn. That's Glenn. She is a 29-year-old millennial and a conservative writer from Wisconsin who has a long history of speaking out against the hateful rhetoric in her party. She lashed out against the problems in the GOP with a powerful 17-part message on Twitter. She has a website, both popular and controversial, collisionofchurchandstate.com, and she is a Christian evangelical. And she's with us today to talk about what happened with the evangelical vote. Marybeth Glenn. Marybeth Glenn, welcome to the program.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
I'm so glad you're here. Your bio describes you so winningly. 29-year-old conservative writer from Wisconsin with a long history of speaking out against the hateful rhetoric in her party. You had me at hello. And then it goes on to say, a mild-mannered, caffeinated bookworm who speaks of literary characters as though they're her friends. And the website, of course, your website is collisionofchurchandstate.com, and you write as an evangelical Christian, I would say intellectual person with a mad love for literature and writing skills to accompany it. So I wanted to get your voice on in the wake of the election in particular, because the evangelical community, as you know, went very strongly for Trump. And I want to start off by asking, may we clone you, and so there would be many millions of you instead?
You can try.
Well, to translate, because you are uniquely positioned, I'm afraid, to do so as a sort of bridge. Translate for me how the evangelical community, which has not been friends to feminism, with some notable exceptions like Jennifer Crumpton and evangelical feminists, but as a whole has been opposed to anti-choice, has been very, very conservative, and treats us as if we were the godless enemy, and yet they went for Trump against all of evidence and what he's done and who he is and what he says, and 2 Corinthians and all that. Is there a disconnect there, or am I having the disconnect?
No, I think the disconnect is in, I think that American Christians are so out of touch. I think that we are, like I explained to someone last night, we're so scared of, or I say we, but I think a lot of evangelicals are so scared of the left pushing Christianity or persecuting. And so in turn, we turn around and we're persecuting other people. And I think that's a problem. I explained to someone last night on the phone, actually, who voted for Trump. I said, the problem is that every excuse that you're giving me is basically can be simplified like this. I don't want to help the refugees, or I'm not going to vote in favor of helping the refugees because somebody wants me to bake a cake that I don't want to make. And I said, and that's really sad that is what Christianity has boiled down to. Yeah. We should be looking at these lives that are hanging in the balance and not putting ourselves first, because to me that should be the foundation of Christianity, is I am not first here. And, the innocent people that I need to be helping, minorities, they are first. They come before me. And we really have that backwards. And I think, I used to call it potluck Christianity, where we're so concerned and we're so obsessed with, the potlucks and the Bible studies where we sit around and, give ourselves accolades when, why aren't we really going out and trying to help people and put the focus on that? And I think that this election has really exposed that.
Well, it's interesting because basically it seems to me you're saying there's more of a culture than a faith or a morality and ethics that it seems to me what you're saying is very Christian. I'm not a Christian, never was, never will be. I'm a very cheerful, moral atheist. But it seems to me that were Christ to come around, he probably would be a refugee, and they would turn him away, and at the same time refuse to bake his wedding cake. So they're not. It seems to me they're betraying Christianity, and in a sense, isn't that what you're saying?
It is. I think that they're betraying the basic principles of Christianity, the basic principles of putting yourself last and really going into places where you are scared, really extending yourself and going into the world and facing your fears and putting faith over fear instead of fear over faith. And I really think that that's what people are doing. I keep hearing over and over again, and I'll say, because my big thing is, refugees, minorities, women, when I'm talking about that, they immediately go on the defense of, well, but we're being persecuted in this way. And I'm like, that's not persecution. Look over to Middle Eastern countries and look to other places and you will find persecution. We are not being persecuted here. And so I think mainly, it's out of touch and it's a denial. And I'm not questioning the faith of these people because it's not my place, but I am questioning the fruits of their faith, and which I think are really sour at this point.
Is it, as we hear and read and hope for, different with younger millennial and younger evangelicals?
Absolutely. I really think that we are, I think that the younger generations are more, especially if they're witnessing this, I think that we're more in touch with seeing a lot of the horrible things that are happening in our world when it comes to people our age and our friends, and really facing issues that, hearing someone say that he, was bragging about sexually assaulting women on tape, hearing Trump say that, it was a lot of my younger friends that were really surprised by it and really blown away by it. I was just befuddled. But it was a lot of my younger friends that were doing that, and it was a lot of my, older conservatives that I know that were kind of excusing it or ignoring it. So I think that we are going to see definitely a generational change in Christianity. Mm-hmm. I think that that's been coming up the pipe for quite a while, to be honest.
Well, that's encouraging. What excuse did the older ones or any evangelicals make for his behavior? Was it he's a sinner, but he's sorry? Or how did they wrap their minds around that,
I kept hearing people use the term, he who casts, who is without sin casts the first stone, which is really surprising. And I think that that's because we had a lot of one-liners in the 1990s and 2000s in Christianity that kind of made their arrival. What would Jesus do? And cast the first stone, and these things we used, but they didn't really use the theology behind it, because the way that they're using that term of casting, being against casting the first stone, they're really twisting the scriptures to get there. I mean, horribly twisting the scriptures to get there. And so I think that a lot of the people in Christianity that are using that, they're using these taglines and one-liners that they know nothing about, that they really don't understand. And I think that that's damaging, and that's a lot of what I heard. I finally, made a huge write-up that I put out on Twitter, but it kind of got buried now. But write-up that I put on Twitter that was, about the dangers of using that term so loosely. And, but I mean, that's the excuse that people are getting. He's a sinner. He's, normal. He's this, he's that. But really, if he's a Christian, we should be holding him to a higher standard. If that's what he's claiming to be, then he needs to be held to a higher standard.
Right. And also, it seems to me, I mean, I am not the theologian that you are, but it seems to me from my little studies in that area that the goal is not in being a sinner. The goal is in being a sinner who sees the light or repent. I mean, the goal is not in sin. And so since he very proudly said, "I have nothing to be forgiven for. I don't ever ask God for forgiveness." It seems to me he kind of forgot the second part.
Right. And because there is that portion of it where we know that, as a Christian, speaking as a Christian, I can say, we know that we're never going to be perfect. And, that's not something that I'm hitting Trump on, but with his inability to realize where he's been wrong, and his apologies are basically, "I'm sorry you were offended." That's not an apology.
That's right.
Yeah, you know what I mean? That's not an apology. That is not, someone who really understands that. Even, you think about his recent picks, putting Steve Bannon, you're talking about elevating a man who said, would you or didn't say it, but is publishing posts on his site that are, would you rather your child had feminism or cancer? Yeah. And you're elevating this person to a place of power. Yeah. That does not, yeah.
How do we change this in the evangelical community? I mean, in other words, what you were saying earlier, that this is based on fear. They're afraid. Hate usually is based on fear. So that fits. That figures. But where their fear ends, and where their actual clinging to a privilege that they had previously, that they feel is now incurred on by black and brown people, women, refugees, the young, all those other, where does that begin? Because just because some people want to say happy holidays to include other holidays does not mean they're against somebody else saying Merry Christmas. You can hold two thoughts in your mind at the same time. How do we communicate that to them, Marybeth?
Right. Or even, you look at the pettiness of complaining about a Starbucks cup. Yeah. That kind of stuff just blows my mind. Yeah. And I think it starts at the churches, but I think that more than anything, it starts at a deeper education. Now we are, in church, we are fed lines, and we are given the simplistic one-liners and pieces of theology. And I think really we need to be brought back down to a core of what Christianity really means and what it stood for. And kind of like Gandhi said, us Christians do not represent our Christ very well. And I think it starts at the churches. I think it starts at ending the hero worship. We've got so many high-profile preachers who people turn to as the all-out, source of information. And it's so damaging to see these men and women that are going that route.
And they're making millions. Sure exactly. They're making millions off the community.
Exactly. And so I'm not sure how to go about how churches go about reforming that. I think it just starts with Christians who are rising up, who want to see the truth, and who want to reform the churches, really getting involved in their church communities. Because I'll be honest, after I made my tweet storm, I didn't go to church for 4 weeks because I was like, man, I'm going to see people that probably are Trump supporters. And I think that that's really a dangerous role to, go into, where we've infused politics so far into our churches. And that's really the reason why, my blog is Collision of Church and State. I started it to really question how Christians were involved in politics and where we really need to be going.
Right. And of course, that supposed wall is there from the framers, both for the protection of the churches and the state. That's what drew me, in fact, to your blog, to begin with. How did you get the way you are? Which is when I jokingly say, can we clone you? Is there a model there? Was it in your family? Were they more liberal in their outlook, or did you have to come here on your own? How did that happen?
My mom was very apolitical. She didn't really get involved in a lot of politics, but growing up, we were brought to homeless shelters, we were brought to food pantries. She really made us kind of listen to, all different voices and people, and instead of just clinging to one side, really listening to both sides. I always joke because I love Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert, and I've always listened to them, and people go, but how do you listen to them? I know that you disagree with some of what they say, and I'm like, well, of course I disagree with them. That doesn't mean that I don't enjoy them or that they don't make good points. So my mom was very encouraging to really listen to every side of things before you give your opinion, before you actually build your opinion. And I think that's something that's important.
It's crucial, and that's the exact opposite of a sort of closed system where you don't want to, quote, expose your children to these dangerous ideas from, outside.
Right.
Well, yeah. I thank you for being who you are. There's many more things I want to ask you, and I hope to be able to come back to you and ask you those things in future. The blog is called collisionofchurchandstate.com. It's so well written. It's so well thought through. I suspect it's genuine Christianity. And we never really got to talk about your conservatism, and that's what I want to have you back on. And I would imagine, since your conservatism is of a type that says no intrusion by the state, that's another reason why you want to keep state and church separate. Am I wrong? Right.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah.
So, and thank you so much. I would love to come back and talk to you.
Well, I
enjoy talking to everybody.
I think it's important, and I wish you well, because I know that you've been accused of being a rhino, a Republican in name only, and an establishment shill. Oh yeah, you sound like such an establishment shill, right? But I applaud your courage and your intelligence, and I hope we'll see you soon, early in the new year. Thank you so much, Marybeth.
Well, thank you.
We need to break one more brief time here at Women's Media Center Live, but I'm Robin Morgan, who will be back directly with some fighting words.
You're listening to Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan.
Welcome back to some fighting words. Goodbye to All That was my notorious essay in 1970, breaking free from a politics of accommodation especially affecting women. During decades of activism, I avoided writing another goodbye until the 2008 primary between Hillary Rodham Clinton and Barack Obama seemed to split two communities, joint conscience keepers of this country, in competition. I had hoped never to write another goodbye. Then came the 2016 election. This Goodbye to All That consists of excerpts from a different, longer, more complete version that will appear as Goodbye to All That 3 on my personal blog at robinmorgan.net on November 28th. The bile began rising in my throat when, the moment Hillary Diane Rodham announced her candidacy, a chorus of male voices began declaring this then wildly popular former Secretary of State guilty of everything from ambition and a sense of entitlement to bad hairstyles and lesbian murder. But I thought that might pass, as she yet again showed her mettle, so I held my tongue. Then came the fear. Way back in the primaries, when to be a Hillary supporter was to invite threats and actual attacks from the left. But Hillary's campaign didn't want to alienate Sanders supporters, so I held my tongue. Goodbye to all that. Goodbye to analyzing Donald Trump. What did he mean? How did he act? What does he want? Look at him. When facing an inmate who thinks he's Jesus, you do not try to reason with him that actually the waves are not his footprints on water. And goodbye to normalization yet again. Senator Elizabeth Warren says we should, quote, put aside our differences. Senator Sanders promises that he and other progressives are prepared to work with Trump. Maybe he'll keep the core of Obamacare. Maybe the wall will only be fenced in parts. Dear people, this is not a slippery slope. This is a sinkhole. This is an earthquake. At least Hillary urged us to re-engage and fight for our values. Then again, she's not in office. When President Obama met Trump in an exercise of civility, hoping to effect disastrous policies through diplomacy, he was protecting the office of the presidency and the peaceful transfer of power. I respect that he was doing his job, and I guess decent elected officials are trying to do theirs. But that's not our job. All along, Trump has been honest about who he is, what he hates, and what he plans to do. He wasn't believed when he openly endorsed torture and advocated war crimes. Trump's own recorded remarks, plus 20 women coming forward with graphic, credible testimonies of sexual assault, were not enough to stop him. It wasn't until late in the campaign that the venerable New York Times even used the word lie to describe everything he said. In the 1930s, the New York Times had assured its readers that, quote, Hitler's anti-Semitism is all posture, period, close quote. But we're told that Hitler analogies are counterproductive. Maybe I should use the Roman Emperor Nero instead. Goodbye to all that. His rancid racism and Islamophobia saturated the campaign and evoked the worst in America to rise from where it had been festering and slither into the public square. But then he reassured everyone he was the least racist person you'll ever meet, so it can't be that bad. He can't mean the other, no? Yet now his transition staff blithely acknowledges to the press, and then denies, and then acknowledges that they are already preparing plans for building the wall without congressional approval and for creating a, quote, Muslim registry, close quote. But columnists say we should root for him to unite the nation. He's appointed as chief White House strategist and senior counsel to the president, Stephen Bannon, infamous for his white nationalism, anti-Semitism, and conspiracy theories, who was formally charged with domestic violence, who admits he wants to destroy the state, to, quote, let the grassroots turn on the hate because that's the only thing that will make them do their duty, close quote. But hey, that was all in the past, in the campaign. Oh, now he's on the transition team? But he says those were jokes, and, oh, now he'll be in the White House. Surely he's changed? Although Breitbart's post-election coverage has run stories headlined, Anti-Democracy Crybabies March by Thousands Nationwide, and Wave of Fake Hate Crimes Sweeps Social Media. Well, let's wait and see. No, 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 goodbye to all that. Waiting, taking them not at their own words, giving them more chances, that's what got us into this nightmare from which we can't wake up. Let this sink in. Trump is where he is precisely because of his abominable statements, acts, and politics. Believe what he says. He has nothing to gain and everything to lose by changing now. Does anyone seriously believe his Supreme Court appointment will be moderate, or that abortion rights for women will be preserved? Even considering that question lowers standards. Maybe we should settle for Newt Gingrich as Secretary of State because, Sarah Palin would be worse. Goodbye, goodbye, goodbye to the yearning for civilized compromise. And goodbye to being afraid all the time, which does not mean there's not a lot to be afraid of. Hillary supporters are accustomed to it and have felt that fear and done it anyway all along. Goodbye to the 5 stages of grief people keep citing. Kubler-Ross was writing about dying and death, which at least has a predictable end. This is more like the crushing breakup of a long, deep relationship where the betraying lover is still alive. Realization breaks in sickening waves over and over, just when you're beginning to heal the least bit, some news or sign, in this case a new cabinet appointment, spins you back down into vomitous darkness. Worse, you catch yourself thinking about something else for a blissful moment, then find that you're actually fighting against that healing moment, as if, were you to drop your guard for that 1 second, you'd be collaborating with all that you detest. As if giving up the grief were the same as giving up the ghost. It's not. And I, must learn how to keep the knife edge of rage sharp, even while slowly pulling the blade out of my heart. No more guilt about feeling whole again, however brief the moment. We need to get whole in order to fight back, to think creatively, to act audaciously. If all else fails, he will eventually overstep even his own bounds, and hubris, as it always does, will bring the tyrant down. Our job is to lessen the number of people who will suffer and die until that moment. Our job is to protect ourselves and one another. Those are my fighting words. Add yours on Twitter, and be sure to tag us at WMC Live and use the hashtag Fighting Words. And that's it for today. We'll be taking a break next week, but we'll be back on December 4th, and I'll be blogging despite the break. This program is syndicated, but if you can't find the broadcast on a radio station in your area, you can always visit us at WMCLive.com for the show, plus the archive of all our previous episodes, and at iTunes worldwide, where you can stream, download, and subscribe to the show's podcast. Also be sure to find WMC Live on Facebook and Twitter, and you can check out my own website and blog at robinmorgan.net. And find me on Facebook and Twitter, too. Portions of this program were taped earlier. Opinions expressed here do not represent the Women's Media Center. Here's the family for Women's Media Center Live. WMC President and Executive Producer of this program, Julie Burton, and our founding and sustaining sponsor, Regina K. Scully. I'm Robin Morgan, your producer and host. Thank you for being with us, and don't forget to join us on December 4th, right here on Women's Media Center Live.
For the smartest talk about news, politics, sex, books, religion, race, and more, tune your radio to Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan. Audacious, witty, provocative, informative, and fun. It's Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan on WMCLive.com. Talk radio with a brain.